All right, let's dive into this. Antifragile. Pretty intriguing title again. Excerpts from Nassim Taleb's book here. So today, we're going to kind of unpack his thinking, really dissect it, and hopefully pull out some of those like valuable nuggets. He's tackling a pretty big question. Why is it that some things actually get stronger when things get rough, while others, well, they just fall apart?
Yeah. He goes beyond that traditional idea of just being resilient, right? Like just bouncing back. Taleb says true strength is about becoming antifragile. It's about using those setbacks, those shocks, those disruptions to actually come out the other side better.
So it's more than just, weathering the storm. It's harnessing that energy, that chaos to propel yourself forward.
Exactly.
And he even says antifragility is beyond resilience or robustness. The resilient resists shocks and stays the same. The antifragile gets better.
Mm-hmm. And he doesn't limit this concept to any one specific area. He shows it playing out in like evolution, how species adapt and improve over time, even in culture and political systems, like how they evolve and refine themselves through challenges.
Oh, and I love this example. He uses a recipe, like a good recipe, one that's been passed down through generations and tweaked and adjusted. It gets more robust, it gets more flavorful because it's incorporated all those little variations.
It kind of highlights an interesting thought, doesn't it? Like maybe this ability to adapt, to evolve, to actually grow in complexity through stress. That's what separates living things from, well, non-living things.
Wow, powerful stuff. And to help us kind of map this out, he gives us this framework. He calls it the triad. Fragile, robust, and anti-fragile.
Yeah, and it's so useful because you can apply it to really anything.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, think about a complex software system, super fragile, right? One little bug can bring the whole thing crashing down. Now you've got a simple mechanical tool. That might be robust. It can handle some wear and tear, but it stays pretty much the same. But then picture a living organism. It's constantly adapting and becoming stronger in response to challenges. That's your anti-fragility.
So, okay, let's bring this into our world a bit. A company that's stuck in its ways, not willing to change, fragile, vulnerable to any disruption.
Right.
A company that can adjust a little bit, maybe that's robust, but a company that thrives on disruption, actively seeks new information and challenges, that's anti-fragile.
Absolutely. That's it. The triad, it's a tool, right? To evaluate systems, strategize, look for ways to improve. By understanding what makes something fragile, we can work towards making it more robust. Or even maybe anti-fragile.
Now, Taleb brings in these characters to illustrate his points, and they're interesting, to say the least. Fat Tony and Nero.
Ah, yeah. These guys. Fat Tony, he's all about street smarts, practical approach to risk, minimize the downside, maximize that upside. Nero's more of the intellectual type, model-driven. And Taleb definitely seems to favor Fat Tony's way of dealing with uncertainty. The real world, It
makes you wonder, doesn't it? Do we sometimes get so caught up in our models and data that we lose sight of those more street-smart insights?
Could be.
It's kind of like that story Taleb tells about Fat Tony making a fortune during the Iraq War.
Yeah.
Everyone else is focused on these predictions about oil prices. Fat Tony, he recognizes the market's already priced in the possibility of war, sees an opportunity that everyone else missed.
Right.
It really highlights that whole don't blindly follow the crowd thing, but also makes me think about this other thing Taleb suggests. A National Entrepreneur Day to celebrate risk takers, even those who, well, fail. What do you make of that? Why that emphasis?
Well, I think Taleb is saying we shouldn't just tolerate failure, we should celebrate it. I mean, it's an essential part of innovation, right? A sign that people are taking risks and pushing boundaries. If there weren't people willing to fail, we wouldn't progress very much.
Interesting perspective.
Yeah.
It really challenges that kind of, knee-jerk reaction to view failure as a bad thing, instead of a potential stepping stone to something greater. You know what else Taleb challenges? Modernity itself. Our whole obsession with trying to control and eliminate randomness.
Yeah, I think that's where the concept of iatrogenics comes in, meaning harm caused by the healer. He's saying a lot of our interventions, even the well-intentioned ones, they end up making things more fragile in the long run.
He even compares modern hospitals to seminarium mortis, seed beds of death. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. It's like he's shining a light on those unintended consequences of excessive intervention. We try to sanitize every aspect of life. We weaken our natural defenses. We create these systems that are vulnerable to those really catastrophic events.
It's almost like we're so focused on eliminating every little risk that we forget our ability to adapt, to overcome. That's what makes us truly strong.
Yeah. Yeah, and that tendency to oversimplify, to try and control everything, it's connected to another really crucial concept, nonlinearity. See, most risk models assume a linear relationship between cause and effect. But Taleb is arguing that real-world systems are often nonlinear, meaning those models drastically underestimate the likelihood of those really extreme events.
So even a small disruption can cascade into this massive system-wide failure because we're not accounting for those nonlinear effects.
Yeah, and that's where fat tails come in. Imagine a bell curve, but with those tails much thicker, that's the idea. In certain systems, extreme events are way more likely than those traditional models predict.
So our meticulously crafted plans, maybe not so foolproof after all. So how do we deal with this reality where unexpected events can have such a massive impact?
Taleb looks back to, believe it or not, Thales, the ancient Greek philosopher. He tells the story of Thales using his astronomy knowledge to secure options on olive presses, limited his downside, maximized his potential profit. Really smart.
I love how he links this ancient wisdom to modern financial concepts, like the barbell strategy, combining extreme risk aversion in some areas with very calculated risk-taking in others.
Exactly. It's about diversifying your approach, not putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. But it also emphasizes that optionality is more than a financial strategy. It's a way of thinking, applicable to everything.
So it's about being flexible, able to change course, to seize opportunities as they arise, not being rigidly tied to a predetermined plan.
Exactly. And this ties into another important point, mistaking the map for the territory. We get so reliant on models and predictions that we lose touch with the complexity of reality.
He uses that great analogy, lecturing birds on how to fly. Just because we can observe something doesn't mean we understand it or that we can control it. We mix up correlation and causation all the time.
All the time.
And I think this is why he talks about the importance of respecting experience, the things that have stood the test of time.
Absolutely. He calls this the Lindy effect. The longer something has survived, the more likely it is to continue surviving.
So instead of constantly chasing the newest trend, maybe we should give a little more weight to the things that have proven their value over time.
That's a key takeaway from the Lindy effect. Look beyond the hype. Think about the long term, whether it's ideas, technologies, even social structures.
It's a bit of a counterintuitive approach in our fast-paced world.
Yeah, and that's why it's so valuable. It's a reminder to step back, look at the big picture, learn from the past, and approach the future, maybe, with a healthy dose of skepticism and humility.
This has been fantastic. We've gone from the definition of antifragility to the triad, fat, Tony, and arrow, optionality, the Lindy effect. It's a lot to take in.
We've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack here. When we're talking about questioning assumptions and stuff, I think that really leads into this whole ethical side of antifragility.
Yeah, Taleb really gets into some interesting territory here. He points out that, there's a real danger when some people benefit from fragility, but at the expense of others. It's like they're shifting the risk, putting the burden on someone else.
Exactly. He calls it transferring fragility, like the 2008 financial crisis. Prime example.
Yeah.
You had certain actors, right, taking massive risks, knowing that if everything went belly up, the taxpayers would be left holding the bag.
And he even coined that term, the Allen Blinder problem.
Right, referring to that former Federal Reserve official who, according to Taleb, actually tried to convince him to invest in a product that basically exploited this loophole to shift the risk onto the public.
It really makes you think about how some systems are set up in a way that protect a select few while leaving everyone else vulnerable.
Absolutely. And Taleb argues that this is not only unethical, but it's ultimately unsustainable. Because when systems become too fragile, when you have this concentration of risk in the hands of a few, it sets the stage for a major collapse.
So, is there a way to create systems that are both ethical and anti-fragile? Does Taleb give us any solutions?
Well, he doesn't lay out like a step-by-step plan, but he does give us some guiding principles.
Okay.
One of them is this idea of skin in the game, meaning those making the decisions, they should have a personal stake in the outcomes.
That makes a lot of sense, right? If they benefit from the decisions, they're more likely to act responsibly. And if they share in the potential downside, well, they'll be a lot more careful about taking those reckless risks.
Exactly. Another principle is decentralization. Centralized systems with those single points of failure, they're inherently fragile. Taleb points to Switzerland. They have this really decentralized political structure. He sees it as an example of resilience.
So spreading the power out, the decision-making across a wider network, it makes the system more adaptable, less susceptible to those shocks.
Right. And it's interesting, this isn't a new idea. Taleb draws parallels to Hammurabi's code,
Oh,
one
wow.
of the oldest legal codes. It had this principle of strict liability for builders.
So like if a building collapsed, the builder was held responsible no matter what. That's pretty intense.
It sounds harsh, but it really incentivized those builders to prioritize safety and durability because their own well-being was directly tied to the outcome of their work.
It's like an early example of how aligning incentives can create a system that's more robust, more accountable.
Right. And it also speaks to this idea that we can learn from the past, from ancient wisdom.
This kind of leads us to another one of Taleb's key points, this whole critique of prediction, especially in complex systems.
Absolutely. Taleb argues that we tend to overestimate our ability to predict the future, especially when it comes to those high-impact, unpredictable events. You know, the ones he calls black swans.
And he's pretty critical of those who say they can see these events coming. He even calls them fragilistas. What's he getting at with that term?
I think he's highlighting how some people benefit from this illusion of knowledge. The more volatile the world is, the more chances they have to make predictions and get attention, even if those predictions are, consistently wrong.
It's almost like a free option for them, right?
Yeah.
Make a bold prediction. If they're right, they're a visionary. If they're wrong, well, everyone forgets pretty quickly.
Exactly. That's why Taleb says, look at their track record, not just what they say. If someone claims they can predict the future, look at their actual history of predictions.
Have they really been right? Or did they just get lucky a few times? It's a good reminder to be skeptical of anyone who claims they have all the answers.
Yeah, it really emphasizes a fundamental truth. Wisdom is often about acknowledging what you don't know, not pretending to know more than you actually do.
That's humbling, but also kind of freeing.
It is.
So how do we actually apply this stuff to our lives? How can we become more anti-fragile in a world that's constantly changing, increasingly complex?
Well, one key takeaway is to embrace an experimental mindset. Don't be afraid to try new things, to step outside that comfort zone, and don't be afraid to fail. Just make sure you learn from your mistakes.
That's easier said than done, right? It seems like we're almost trained to be afraid of failure.
But you have to remember, mistakes are valuable, especially when they're small and don't have those really big consequences. Taleb calls those small errors. They give us feedback. They help us learn and grow without causing too much damage.
So it's about building that resilience through trial and error, not letting the fear of making a mistake paralyze you.
Exactly. And another important part of this is building redundancy into your life, creating options. The whole don't put all your eggs in one basket thing. Diversify your skills, your investments, your interests. It'll make you much more adaptable, less vulnerable to those unexpected shocks.
And don't be afraid to go against the grain. If you see an opportunity, something others are missing, take that contrarian approach.
Think back to Fat Tony. He did pretty well betting against the conventional wisdom.
That's right, he did.
It's about being open to different perspectives, not blindly following the crowd.
So maybe we should all try to be a little less Nero and a little more Fat Tony.
I think that's a great goal. It's about embracing a more intuitive, less theoretical approach to risk and uncertainty.
And it's about being open to the unexpected. Recognizing that disorder, volatility, they can actually be opportunities.
That's what antifragility is all about.
So far, we've covered ethical considerations, the limitations of prediction, and some practical steps for becoming more antifragile.
And to round out our exploration, I think in the next part, we should really focus on how these ideas apply, not just to systems, but to our personal lives as well. How they can help us navigate uncertainty and thrive in a world that's, constantly changing.
Okay, so we've talked about antifragility in these bigger systems, but what about us, our own lives? How can we, as individuals, cultivate that anti-fragile mindset?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Taleb really gets into this idea of using heuristics, those rules of thumb that kind of guide our decisions, even if we don't always write them down.
You mean those instinctive ways of navigating the world often passed down, from generation to generation, or just learned through experience?
Exactly. Taleb's argument is that these heuristics, they've been honed, over centuries through trial and error. They can actually be more effective than those complex models, especially when we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty.
That makes sense. Think about it like a doctor or an investor, someone with a ton of experience. They often rely on their intuition, on pattern recognition, even if they can't always, fully explain why they made a certain decision.
Right. He's suggesting that we shouldn't just dismiss these heuristics as irrational. We should pay attention to them. They often hold a lot of practical wisdom.
So it's like, maybe grandma's advice isn't so outdated after all, haha.
Could be.
There's a reason why certain things, certain practices have lasted for so long. So how do we actually apply this to our own lives? How can we be more anti-fragile on a personal level?
I think one really important way is to cultivate a growth mindset. Seeing those challenges not as setbacks, but as opportunities to learn, to grow. Don't be afraid to fail, as long as you learn from those mistakes.
So it's about changing how we view failure, right? Not a setback, but a valuable lesson.
Exactly. And it goes back to what we talked about before, Taleb's concept of small errors. Those manageable mistakes that give you feedback without leading to disaster.
Like taking calculated risks, experimenting, iterating, constantly learning as you go.
Exactly. And another really important part of this is, I think, building resilience into your everyday life.
What do you mean by that? What would that look like?
Think about stuff like exercise, meditation, or even just spending time in nature. All of these things can help you build up, physical and mental strength to cope with stress, with adversity.
So it's like building up those reserves, so to speak.
Yeah, strengthening those inner resources so you can better handle whatever comes your way.
It's not just about weathering the storm, it's about coming out of it stronger.
And don't underestimate the power of, gratitude and perspective. That can be huge when things get rough. And one more thing, I think it's crucial to surround yourself with, a good community, people who support your growth and who challenge you to be your best.
Yeah, having those strong relationships can really make a difference, especially when things get tough. A strong network.
Exactly. It can provide strength and perspective, remind you that you're not alone in facing those challenges.
So just to kind of bring it all together, becoming more anti-fragile, it's about embracing those challenges, building resilience into your everyday life, and having strong relationships.
I think that's a great way to put it. Remember, antifragility, it's more than just a theory, it's a way of life.
It's a mindset, a way of approaching the world with curiosity, with resilience, and with that willingness to embrace the things we don't know.
And by doing that, we don't just survive, we thrive. We turn those challenges into opportunities to grow, to change for the better.
This has been an amazing deep dive. We've explored antifragility, from the basics to the ethics, and some really practical ways to use it in a world that never stops changing.
I hope you've gained some valuable insights. A new way of looking at the world, maybe.
And who knows? Maybe by embracing antifragility, you can benefit from those unexpected turns. You can turn those challenges into opportunities. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.